In this module, we shall discuss about the Post-GATT International Economic Order. The Post-GATT Economic Order is termed as New Economic Order, which was coined by developing countries. The developing countries are calling for a new economic order because they feel that the trading system discriminates against them. Whether GATT will emerge from the present negotiations better adapted to the third world remains to be seen. In 1944, near the end of the World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference made recommendations to set up three international organizations, that is International Monetary Fund or IMF to deal with balance of payments problem, World Bank, that is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to deal with problems of reconstruction and development, and ITO, that is the International Trade Organizations, to deal with the problems of international trade. The first two were set up in 1945, but there were serious controversies about third. Therefore, USA, UK and the few other countries set up in 1947 an interim organization about trade named GATT, that is General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. India was a founder member of all the three. A few years later, the Havana Conference recommended the setting up of ITO with support of the USA administration. But the USA Congress refused to ratify it. Therefore, the ITO could not be set up and the GATT was continued. All the three organizations were dominated by USA. The GATT in particular was biased in favor of the developed countries and was called informally as the Rich Men's Club. The General Agreement on Tariff and Trade is an important institution established in 1947 to encourage the reduction of trade barriers among its 23 member countries. The expanding GATT membership reflects the success that this organization has had in facilitating multilateral tariff liberalization. As a consequence of the 8 negotiating rounds that GATT has sponsored, the average ad valorem tariff on industrial goods has fallen from 40% to below 4%. In light of its significance for the world economy, an important question for economists is whether a theoretical interpretation of GATT and its main features can be provided. From 1948 to 1994, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade provided the rules for much of the world trade and presided over periods that saw some of the highest growth rates in international commerce. The Havana Conference began on 21st November 1947, less than a month after GATT was signed. The ITO Charter was finally agreed in Havana in March 1948. But ratification in some national legislatures proved impossible. The most serious opposition was in the US Congress, even though the US government had been one of the driving forces. In 1950, the United States government announced that it would not seek congressional ratification of the Havana Charter and the ITO was effectively dead. So the GATT became the only multilateral instrument governing international trade from 1948 until the WTO was established in 1995. If the continents from that hesitant start in 1948 in Havana, Cuba via annexee, that is France, Tokyo seemed well established. But throughout those 47 years, it was a provisional agreement and organization. Much of the history of those 47 years was written in Geneva, but it also traces a journey that spanned UK, Tokyo, Punta del Este and Montreal in Canada, Brussels in Belgium and finally to Marrakesh in Morocco in 1994. During that period, the trading system came under GATT, salvaged from the aborted attempt to create the ITO. GATT helped establish a strong and prosperous multilateral trading system that became more and more liberal through rounds of trade negotiations. But by the 1980s, the system needed a thorough overhaul. This led to the Uruguay Round and ultimately to the WTO. As in the early years, the GATT trade rounds concentrated on further reducing tariffs. Then the Kennedy Round in the mid-60s brought about a GATT. Anti-dumping agreement and a section on the development. The Tokyo Round during the 70s was the first major attempt to tackle trade barriers that do not take the form of tariffs and to improve the system. The 8th, the Uruguay Round of 1986 to 94 was the last and most extensive of all. It led to the WTO and a new set of agreements. The WTO replaced GATT as an international organization, but the general agreement still exists as the WTO's umbrella treaty for trade in goods, updated as result of the Uruguay Round negotiations. Trade lawyers distinguish between GATT 1994, the updated part of GATT, and GATT 1947, the original agreement which is still the heart of GATT 1994. For most of us, it's enough to refer simply to GATT. The developing countries strongly protested against the bias of the GATT, favoring the developed countries and demanded that ITO be set up. The UN appointed a committee in 1963 to consider how best this could be done because the US Congress was still likely to veto any new proposal for ITO. This UN committee recommended as a possible alternative UNCTAD, that is United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to be set up as a part of the UN Secretariat to avoid being subject to veto by US Congress. The UNCTAD was set up in 1964 on the basis of this alternative. During the negotiations for setting up UNCTAD, the developing countries established a organization, G77, that is group of 77 developing countries, which was later joined by most of the developing countries. This G77 was opposed by the USA and some other important developed countries called G7 or group of 7 developed countries. At the outset, several developed countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, were very sympathetic positions taken by G77. Nevertheless, the pressure of G77 made the UNCTAD gain in stature, and at one time it appears as if it might replace the GATT as it continued to be powerful. However, sustained pressure of G77 made GATT progressively more liberal, and the Tokyo Round of the GATT gave a very important concession to the developing countries, namely GSTP, that is General Scheme for Trade Preferences. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the importance of the Tokyo Round and the Uruguay Round. Know GATT as new institutional framework. Understand shifts in political power and in trade flows. Know the linkage between GATT and developing world. First, we shall discuss the Tokyo Round. The Tokyo Round lasted from 1973 to 1979 with 102 countries participating. It continued GATT's efforts to progressively reduce tariffs. The results included an average 1/3 cut in custom duties in the world's 9 major industrial markets, bringing the average tariff on industrial products down to 4.7%. The tariff reductions phased in over a period of 8 years involved an element of harmonization. The higher the tariff, the larger the cut proportionally. On other issues, the Tokyo Round had mixed results. It failed to come to the grips with the fundamental problems affecting farm trade and also stopped short of providing a modified agreement on safeguards, that is emergency import measures. Nevertheless, a series of agreements on non-tariff barriers did emerge from the negotiations, in some cases interpreting existing GATT rules, in others breaking entirely new ground. In most cases, only a relatively small number of mainly industrialized GATT members subscribed to these agreements and arrangements. Because they were not accepted by the full GATT membership, they were often informally called codes. They were not multilateral, but they were a beginning. Several codes were eventually amended in the Uruguay Round and turned into multilateral commitment accepted by all WTO members. Only 4 remained plurilateral, those on government procurement, bovine meat, civil aircraft and the dairy products. In 1997, WTO members agreed to terminate the bovine meat and dairy agreements, leaving only 2. GATT was provisional with a limited field of action, but its success over 47 years in promoting and securing the liberalization of much of the world trade is incontestable. Continual reductions in tariffs alone helped spur very high rates of world trade growth during the 1950s and 60s, around 8% a year on average. And the momentum of trade liberalization helped ensure that trade growth consistently outpaced production growth throughout the GATT era, a measure of countries' increasing ability to trade with each other and to reap the benefits of trade. The rush of new members during the Uruguay Round demonstrated that the multilateral trading system was recognized as an anchor for development and an instrument of economic and trade reform. Moving on to the Uruguay Round. The emergence of USA as a single superpower after the up of USSR greatly increased its clout, with prompting and strong support from TNCs, that is transnational corporations, which got specially interested in this juncture. USA pressed that GATT should no longer be confined only to tariff and trade in goods, but should be also extended to services, investment and intellectual property rights, and there should be a WTO, that is World Trade Organization, to oversee all these 4. When the various arguments for and against such are formed, GATT or WTO was placed on the table and some compromises seemed possible. The then Director General of GATT Dunkel proposal were accepted by all the members of the GATT in December 1993 at the official level and in March 1994 at the ministerial level. But about dozen countries, including the USA and India, while signing the draft agreement, put in the reservation that they would not ratify it until their respective legislatures approved it. The WTO and its ancillary agreements, that is revised GATT regarding tariffs and trade about goods including agricultural commodities, GATTs, that is regarding services, TRIMS regarding investment and TRIPS regarding intellectual property rights, and a provision for across retaliation between sectors for violation of the prescribed conditionalities are scheduled to come into effect on January 1, 1995 with a grace period of 1 year for least developed countries. Opposing the Uruguay Round are consumer groups including Public Citizen, which is the leader of the anti-Uruguay coalition. Environmental groups, which in contrast to their positions on NAFTA, opposition to the Uruguay Round. Organized labor with the Textile and Garment Workers Union and the International Union of Electrical Workers as the most prominent critics. Ross Perot and his grassroots organization United We Stand America and various right-wing individuals and organizations including Pat Buchanan and Jesse Helms are North Carolina. The opposition to the Uruguay Round is not nearly as vocal as their opposition to NAFTA was. However, Ralph Nader and Public Citizen have been the leading and most active opponents. A few unions have devoted some meaningful attention to the issue and Pat Buchanan and some other conservative forces have been staunch in their opposition. But the AFL-CIO has done little more than pass a resolution criticizing the Uruguay Round implementing legislation. Most of the environmental organizations have generally ignored the issue, and despite an outcry from his United We Stand organization, Ross Perot was exceptionally quiet about the trade pact until September. In significant part because the opposition has been less organized than it was for NAFTA, Uruguay Round proponents have also been less vocal than they were in NAFTA Rome. But less vocal does not mean inactive. The Office of the US Trade Representative, that is USTR, headed by Mickey Cantor, has been the most aggressive of the Clinton administration's agencies. Cantor and his deputies have vigorously touted the purported benefit of the Uruguay Round on Capitol Hill and moved quickly to respond to any sign of a threat to congressional passage of the trade agreement. The overall effect of the Uruguay Round would be to level the playing field, says Bruce Bunch, a spokesperson for General Electric. Leveling the playing field can fairly be translated as preventing national governments from favoring domestic producers and limiting governmental ability to regulate corporations in general. Achievement of these broad goals is fostered by what the Chambers of Commerce Howard identifies as the key elements of the agreement: the reduction in tariffs, the expansion of trade rules to cover new areas, and the creation of the WTO. One of the ways the Uruguay Round extends trade rules to new areas in its explicit application of GATT rules to the category of technical barriers of trade, which means product standards designed to protect the environment, consumer safety, worker health and similar ends. From the perspective of the corporate backers of the Uruguay Round, in the last couple of decades, technical standards have developed into substantial barriers to international commerce. But trade barriers are in the eyes of the beholder. Critics of the Uruguay Round see many of the laws described as technical barriers by business interests as hard-fought citizens' victory won in democratic arena, providing important protections to people's and environmental well-being. US Uruguay Round opponents fear foreign-based companies will encourage their governments to challenge the generally more advanced US health, safety and environmental regulations as unfair barriers to trade. Already in reports published by the European Union, Japan and Canada, the major US trading partners have identified a host of US laws designed to protect consumer and environmental well-being that they believe to be illegal barriers to trade. A sampling of the US laws on the hit list illustrates the wide array of laws that may be vulnerable to attack under the new GATT. These laws and regulations include regulations limiting the level of lead permitted in ceramic dishes, domestic safety law covering electric shavers, and a California law requiring glass containers for food and beverages to contain a minimum percentage of recycled glass. Uruguay Round opponents also fear that US-based companies may manipulate the process to challenge domestic laws as well. The Uruguay Round will provide a great incentive for US companies to rent a government to pursue trade challenges of policies that could not be shaped to their liking through the democratic process, says Lori Wallish, Director of Public Citizens Trade Program. The problem is that GATT's long-standing non-discrimination principle has been expanded in the Uruguay Round into a battery of stringent tests which go far beyond any rational interpretation of non-discrimination. Any health, safety or environmental measure must be able to pass all of these tests, or its risks being declared GATT legal. Probably the most severe of these tests is the requirement that a health, safety or environmental measure be the least trade restrictive means to achieve a particular goal. The political infeasibility of a purportedly less trade restrictive alternative would not be a defense. Since legislators almost never consciously seek the least trade restrictive means to achieve a particular goal, and since the test lends itself to creative applications, virtually any safety law may be open to challenge. Public Citizens Wallish provided a list of illustrative potential challenges in October 1994 testimony before the Senate Commerce Committee. Under the least trade restrictive test, she explained, if the United States decided Canada could argue as it did an amicus brief that a phase out of all asbestos should not apply to the asbestos produced in Canada because the health risk of the relatively less hazardous Canadian can be controlled to ban asbestos lined brakes because US workers are exposed to the asbestos when they install or repair the brakes. Another country could argue that the ban is unnecessary because the workers could use protective clothing and ventilation to limit the risk. In making their broadest critics, Uruguay Round opponents argue that the least trade restrictive test encapsulates the basic thrust of the new GATT. Velez says that Uruguay Round could impose on the word and ideology of Tejibio allies, that is, subordinating environmental, consumers and workers protectionists to the dictates of international commerce. According to an interpretation recently given by the GATT Secretariat, all the present members of GATT 1947 which amended by Tokyo Round have three alternatives to choose from. The first one is withdraw from GATT 1947 once they join the WTO. The second is remain a GATT 1947 member without being a WTO. The third is remain a GATT 1947 member, also join the WTO. GATT is certainly not perfect, but most observers agree that its principles have worked remarkably well to liberalize world trade. Can these principles also be applied to the variety of new issues before the WTO? A number of these issues, such as agreements on labor and environmental standards, would extend GATT's reach well beyond traditional trade policy matters and as such appear to encroach the traditional limits of national sovereignty. This raises fundamental question about the structure of international economic relations among the sovereign states. Therefore, an important analytical question concerns the minimal range of policies over which the international negotiations must proceed if global efficiency is to be achieved. The GATT is not only harmful for the South, but is equally so for the industrial countries, that is the North. The coterie of the G7 leaders goes on having lavish banquets several times a year, presumably to sort out global issues. On a recent occasion, the main topic was the menace of unemployment, currently running into some 35 million or more depending on the definition in these countries. Evidently, this is a burning question, but the leaders came to know no worthwhile decision to ameliorate the situation. Meanwhile, the problem appears to become even more intractable and the rich societies are plagued by a degree of social and economic polarization not witnessed in the past half century. The issue of widening inequalities in the North, but he dismisses all too lightly the widespread perception in the North that cheap imports of textiles, garments, leather products, etc. from South have played a significant role in displacing unskilled labor in the North and pushing the wages down in the whole economy. Now we shall discuss GATT as new institutional framework. In the long run, the post-war institutional framework for international economic transactions must be adapted to emerging new political relationships between the market economies and the centrally planned economies and between the developed and developing countries. The existing framework was never international in scope. Founded by a few developed market economies and dominated by the victorious Western allies, the GATT was poorly tailored to the needs of the developing countries and not designed to include the centrally planned economies. Moving on to the shifts in political power and in trade flows. The detente between the major market and centrally planned economies means that ideological considerations will influence trade flows between them to a lesser extent in the future than in the past. The tough competition for markets should increase the trade flows between markets and planned economies. It may also increase the trade flows between developed and developing countries within the market economy system. These shifts in the political powers through decolonization and detente have contributed to the present crisis in the international trade and payment system, whether GATT emerged better adapted to the needs of developing countries and to accommodate larger flows of East-West trade remains to be seen. GATT once established a number of rules designed to achieve multilateral, non-discriminatory and mutually beneficial freer trade after bilateral, discriminatory and beggar-thy-neighbor protectionist policies. However, GATT's success is modest when measured against the goals. Most striking is the limited degree to which GATT has actually achieved these goals and the gradual erosion of its rules. Now we will discuss GATT and developing world. Trade liberalization in GATT has been biased in a manner reflecting the composition of its original members, mainly all developed industrial economies. Trade has not been liberalized for those agricultural and industrial countries having comparative disadvantage relative to the developing countries. Furthermore, in spite of the GATT's rules, the developed countries have felt themselves free to use other distortions to trade than tariffs when it has suited their purposes. GATT's rules have not prevented the developed market economies from forming discriminatory trading blocs. As these blocs increase in size, they assume an autocratic and protectionist posture, blocking further trade liberalization. GATT's acceptance of the increased practice of bilateralism, preferential trading agreements and other protectionist distortions than tariffs clearly conflicts with its preachings. Now let us summarize what we have learnt in this module. The post-GATT economic order is termed as new economic order, which was coined by developing countries. The developing countries are calling for a new economic order because they feel that the trading system discriminates against them. Whether GATT will emerge from the present negotiations better adapted to the third world remains to be seen. The UNCTAD was set up in 1964 on the basis of this alternative. During the negotiations for setting up UNCTAD, the developing countries established an organization, G77, that is group of 77 developing countries, which was later joined by most of the developing countries. The Tokyo Round lasted from 1973 to 1979 with 102 countries participating. It continued GATT's efforts to progressively reduce tariffs. The results included an average 1/3 cut in custom duties in the world's 9 major industrial markets, bringing the average tariff on industrial products down to 4.7%. One of the ways the Uruguay Round extends trade rules to new areas, its explicit application of GATT rules to the category of technical barriers to trade, which means product standards designed to protect the environment, consumer safety, worker health and similar ends. From the perspective of the corporate backers of the Uruguay Round, in the last couple of decades, technical standards have developed into substantial barriers to international commerce. Trade liberalization in GATT has been biased in a manner reflecting the composition of its original members, mainly all developed industrial economies. Trade has not been liberalized for those agricultural and industrial countries have comparative disadvantage relative to the developing countries.